grace.
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 All right, so tonight we're actually starting Ecclesiastes. Last week was the intro, and this week we begin. So chapter 1, starting in verse 1, I am reading from the ESV. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, it isn't terribly important, but here in the first verse, Solomon is identified as king in Jerusalem, whereas in verse 12, he adds king over Israel in Jerusalem. That's important because of the fact that it's that phrase right there that illustrates that it was a united kingdom when this was written. Is everybody understanding me? Yes or no? Does that make sense? Because you can be king over the southern kingdom and you'd be expected to be in Jerusalem. But it says he's king over Israel, but he's reigning from Jerusalem. Israel indicates all of Israel as united Israel rather than when they were divided. So it puts them into a time period of Solomon's reign. Because Solomon's reign was the only time really when, other than Saul, when there was an uncontested, united Israel. After Solomon, it divided. So, and remember we were talking about dating last week, and that is one of the things that helps date at least the words that we have as originally penned by Solomon were penned during the time period of his life. Does everybody understand why that's important? Okay. I mean, as far as the content of the book, not terribly important, but some translations like the Septuagint have added in verse 1 over Israel, so it's consistent with verse 12. The simple statement is more important than it appears because, again, it identifies the time period and the one who wrote these sayings, and that is important for two reasons. The first is that Solomon, as I said to you in our introduction to Ecclesiastes last week, was a very unique position. He was in a very unique position in all of human history to write this book, being the most wise, the most powerful, the most wealthy, the most influential person we know of. He would have been in the perfect position to seek out wisdom, folly, lasting value, and transient value of anybody that we know of in history. So the person who claims to be the writer, being the writer, is what gives a lot more value to the words. Don't get me wrong. The fact that all scripture is inspired is what gives it truly gives it value. But God deliberately chose certain people to speak what he spoke through. Amen. And those people add to the value. Does that make sense? So that being the case, it is important that it was Solomon. Secondarily, it's important for the integrity of scripture. This book claims to have been written by Solomon, and yet modern, as I said last week, textual analysis suggests otherwise, so time and authorship are incredibly important. Now, as I said last week, secular scholars have some very good literary basis for dating this book late, so we don't want to treat that evidence lightly, but also, as I told you last week, I believe they are incorrect for some very solid reasons, which we've already covered. I'm not going to cover them again. But in the end, the dating of the book is not truly dependent on the date of the copies, right? Obviously, a copy is more recent than the original it's being copied from. That's, stands to reason. A book can be compiled, translated, and updated at an entirely later date than the source material for which it's drawn. So we saw this in when we looked in Proverbs. If you remember, some of the Proverbs were recorded. It says so right in the little title of the chapter of the division of Proverbs that these following Proverbs were written by Solomon, but he didn't compile them into the book of Proverbs. They were later compiled and placed into the greater book of Proverbs by King Hezekiah many years after Solomon died. And so we have examples of that in Scripture. First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles are another example. Not exactly a side-by-side comparison, oranges with oranges, because this is the words of a person, whereas First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles are a historical document. Therefore, you expect it to be written after the events, because otherwise you wouldn't know what those events were. But you get the idea that you can have the words of kings, the words of people written down many years later, and it still be an accurate representation of what they said. The material came from that person, even though it was recorded many years later. So this is a way in which Solomon would still be the one who wrote the words, and yet they were not compiled into an actual scroll for general use until much later. That's a possibility. The reason, again, why this is important is because the only way these words can be held as true is if the one identifying themselves as the writer is the writer. If they aren't, well, then you have to flush the whole book, because the book says this was written by Solomon. If it wasn't, it has no business being in the Bible. It's already has to be excluded. So you see why it is important. Otherwise, it really wouldn't. We don't really care when it was written, because it can represent the words of Solomon. But if it doesn't really represent the words of Solomon, the whole book's a lie. So that's why this is important, okay? At the end of the day, only Solomon fits the profile, not only due to his mention as the writer at the beginning, but also due to the fact that he is represented here as being king over all of Israel, but reigning from the city of Jerusalem. That was only possible for the first three kings of Israel, and only one of them is named, and that's Solomon. So that's why all of this is important. So verse 2, the first actual statement he makes in the book of Ecclesiastes is, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now, I told you last week, your translation might say teacher. Some other translation might say the speaker, or any other word you can use instead of preacher. The ESV just happened to use the word preacher. As I told you before, the actual word in the Hebrew doesn't even really address who's speaking. It's addressing who is being addressed. Okay, really, this is talking about the one who speaks to the assembly, without telling you who that person is. They just throw the word teacher, preacher, whatever in there, just to have a noun, or whatever to associate with it. So preacher, teacher, doesn't matter. Now, this is the first in a list of 38 times this phrase of vanity or vanity of vanities, or a similar word like that, will appear in these 12 short chapters. 38 times, 12 chapters. So it shows up a lot, okay? The word vanity is havel, and it means vapor, breath, or mist. So not midst, but mist, like a vapor mist, okay? And is used to describe life as fleeting, unsatisfying, and incomprehensible. Now that is very important, since the word vanity is altogether a different idea. Would you agree? And yet, in most translations, they use the word vanity. So I thought, I'm not sure that that's really the right word, or that's the best word choice. So I went on, one of my long studies, and because I thought maybe a better representation would be temporal or fleeting, something that doesn't last long, would be a better representation of the word vanity. And I was told unequivocally that I was absolutely correct, but that vanity is also absolutely correct. And there's a reason for that. So I'm going to explain a little bit to you. And the only reason why is because of the fact that it allows us some fungibility as we're reading through it. There are some times when vanity is actually a better representation of what Solomon was trying to say. Other times, fleeting or temporal would be a better word. Is everybody following? Okay. Now, this is the reason. Vanity implies that something is altogether pointless. And while this may be proper in some places because it is used to represent how Solomon felt about something, in most cases, it's not really true in and of itself. Like it would say life is vanity, or we just got done reading, all is vanity, all is meaningless. Well, can you really say that everything in existence is meaningless? Of course not. So either he's delusional, and that's an option because he's looking through a filter, right? None of the words that we're reading, well, not none of, many of the words we are reading are not truths that are absolute in themselves. They're absolute through the eyes of Solomon. It's written from Solomon's perspective, right? And I told you about his lens last week, right? The lens he's looking through is a man who had retained the gift of wisdom throughout his life, but lived a very pagan lifestyle. And so he had a very clear and distorted filter all at one time, which makes this book very valuable. And I explained more on that last week. I'm not going to go repeat myself. You can go back and listen to it if you want to see better understand. But vanity implies something that's altogether pointless. And again, while this may be proper in some places because it is used to represent how Solomon felt about something, it most often is not true in and of itself. For example, while one's labor under the sun rarely produces something that is of eternal value, it does produce immediate value and therefore could not honestly be deemed as useless, right? It might have only produced enough to pay my rent this week or this month, and a year from now, a month from now, that will mean nothing, certainly an eternity from now, that will have no meaning. But can you say that it never had any meaning? No, of course it did. It had temporal, fleeting meaning, but it didn't make it vain. Is everybody understanding where we're getting at with that? As Solomon often uses this word, useless. Most of the comments of Solomon are within the context of his very subjective set of conditions which need to be met in order for something to be considered of lasting value. And we're going to explore that as we're going through the book. What are those set of conditions? They're very, very subjective. They're not universal in any way. In the end, though, it is often Solomon's conditions which are, in fact, the vain thing. Okay? It's not what he's talking about that's vain. It's his conditions that are vain. All right. So after much consideration, I believe it wise to broaden our definition of this Hebrew word havel to include the possibilities of its root and native meanings, which would be temporary or fleeting, and allowing the context to tell us which one is which. Sometimes the context will tell you this literally means meaningless. Other times it will mean fleeting or temporary. A great example of this is this whole first chapter, which is largely about the transient nature of life. The past generation's impact does not last, and the impacts we have while alive quickly fade and are generally remembered no more. This is no basis for claiming that what was done during any individual time period was of no value and therefore utterly vain, but rather what it implies is that those actions produced only a temporary or fleeting impact. Okay? So while vanity is not a bad word, nor is futile, which is employed by other translations, and those are the ones that are most commonly used, there are clearly times it would be more consistent with the actual meaning of both the Hebrew word havel as well as its usage in the text we're reading to say that it's fleeting or temporary. And we will cross those bridges when you run into it, but I just wanted to drop that in your head now because vanity is not always going to mean vanity. Okay, so I think that was important to bring up at the beginning. I freely admit that I'm no Hebrew scholar and therefore have no expertise in this direction. I do possess at least a modicum of common sense, though. So I took my thoughts and submitted them to some searches on the subject and found that I'm not alone in my persuasions about this. The only reason it is important is because being such a primary theme mentioned throughout the entire book, properly capturing the nuance of the thought is likely to greatly impact our understanding and therefore influence it towards or away from what God was trying to say in the book. So that's the reason why it's important to tack this down. Another good example of this is if havel meant solely meaningless, then Solomon's advice to enjoy simple pleasures like eating, drinking, and working would be contradictory to his other statements. In fact, Solomon was saying that it is precisely because life is temporary and fleeting, that's why you should enjoy these gifts from God when they present themselves and are available to you. Okay? So it couldn't mean meaningless. It really would mean in those cases temporary. It had the fact that I worked all week long and I can enjoy the fruits of my week on Friday night and Saturday over the weekend. That only affects this weekend, so it's temporary and fleeting, but it's not completely useless. There's a third option that I think is worth at least mentioning in passing of what vanity also could represent. And that is, it's suggested in many searches that the use of the word havel as an enigma and therefore paradoxical. An example of this would be the apparent absurdity or the unfairness of life, like when one righteous person dies young while another unrighteous or even blatantly wicked man lives a long and prosperous life. It seems to present an enigma, a paradox, okay? And that could also be another meaning for the word vanity, okay? So again, we will explore these as we're going through the book, but I wanted to mention it in its first mentioning. We got 37 more times it's going to show up, so we want to have at least a basis of, a little box of definitions from which to draw as we're reading through this. One Catholic columnist writer named William Hemsworth offered this example in his article, Havel and the Perplexing Nature of Ecclesiastes. That was the name of his article. And I thought it was a very good little statement he says here. He says, imagine that the meaning of life is contained in steam or vapor. You grab, and yet you're not able to grasp the vapor. At best, your hands get wet, but that's not the vapor. Soon you give up because the endeavor is futile, because one is not physically able to grasp a gas. The attempt is fleeting, meaningless, and even transient. Does that mean that the vapor itself is meaningless? Not at all. But that such is the outcome or the judgment we make based on our interaction with it. I think that was a great way of capturing the way this is used throughout the book. Sometimes it's talking about the object really is. Sometimes it's talking about our interactions with it are what seems futile. Okay, and he uses Ecclesiastes 2:11 as the token example, and that is, then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all of it was vanity and was striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So again, it has to do with our interactions with it, right? So now, verse 3 introduces the first question. What does mankind gain from all of his toil? So verse 3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. Now, this is a little bit of a side note, but again, I like to address these things when we run into them, not only for your benefit, but really also for the handful of people that regularly listen to the messages on YouTube. I just like to mention this. Since the scriptures are inspired and not dictated, this is what we just read is stated from Solomon's human perspective, and is no more intended to be a scientific statement than it is when your phone or your meteorologist announces sunrise is at 7 a.m. It doesn't mean the sun's actually moving around the earth. It just means relative to where you are on the earth, it looks like it. Okay? And we still use it today, don't we? Even though most people believe in a spherical earth and that the sun moves around the sun, we still use the term sunrise and sunset, don't we? Right? So it's not to be taken as a scientific statement. Most people refer to dawn and dusk as sunrise and sunset. So it's not really wise to read more into a statement than is actually there. Those who are sticklers for taking the scriptures literally, even when it's clear linguistically that it was said as a metaphor or a turn of phrase, run into problems themselves. The Bible speaks about the four quarters of the earth, and yet it also says that God sits above the circle of the earth. Well, you can't have circles and corners at the same time. So you're going to have to pick your, where you stand on something, right? Was something used metaphorically, or was it intended to be taken literally? And I think it's very obvious in this particular case. It just meant the sun. When the sun in the sky looks like it's going up and when it's going down. Verse 6, the wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again, meaning it goes in a circuit. He's trying to point out the secular, nature of life. You start off with with spring, and then you go to summer, then fall, and then winter, and then there you are, right back with spring again. You start with the water being melted from the ice caps and running down into the sea, and then it evaporates and goes back and rains down on the tops of the mountains and freezes again, and the cycle starts all over again. That's what he's pointing to, is how things repeat themselves. That's what he's getting at. Okay. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. It doesn't just end at the sea and just get to the point where the whole earth floods. It starts a cycle all over again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. So there's just an ongoingness to this. And this was part of the drudgery of life for Solomon. And maybe you have had times in your life where you've experienced this as well. I don't know about you. I mean, one thing I often hear from almost everybody as they get older is, "You're kidding me? It's Christmas again?" Didn't we just have Christmas 2 months ago? And really it's been 12 months. You know what I mean? So I'm getting nods all over the place. So you know what I'm talking about. There's this circular nature to life. And after a period of time, it gets a little wearisome. You're like, could we find another pattern to go with? Because this one's getting old. And I think that's the way Solomon, I know that's where Solomon was coming from. Yes,
I had heard someone say once that, and it wasn't really related to age, it was more the times, but the essence of time.
Yeah. Changes as you get older.
Yeah.
Your perception of it. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the reason why things like what we're experiencing right now, for at least for Floridian, some people up north are not so happy, but for Floridian is really quite refreshing. To have it in the mid 80s all the way into May, that's not normal. By now we're usually in the upper 90s, and we're sweltering to death, and it's not terrible this year. So breaking the pattern, hey, that's nice. I think that's one of the things that Solomon was getting at, but he was coming at it from a more global and depressing standpoint. He was weary of life itself, depressed with life itself. And that's a deadly place to be. I think every human being's been there at some point. Many of us revisit it, but it's not a wise, or even it's not even an honoring place towards God to remain in your thoughts, right? One of the reasons why you think that way is because your mind is so grounded in things here and now, as though everything in your life is under the sun, right? And the wording that he uses. And your life isn't just under the sun, unless you're talking about Jesus, right? You're under that sun. But everything that goes on in this life doesn't have to be viewed through a dark and dreary lens. Because there are purposes for why there's a repeating nature to everything in earth. Everything in nature has got a repeating nature. And there's a reason for it. There's lessons in it for us. And if we learn our lesson, we can see life in it rather than drudgery. Are you seeing what I'm saying? And I think that, and I know that's one of the reasons why Solomon saw drudgery. That's one of the reasons why he saw vanity and meaninglessness and vanity and all of this. So what verse 9 says, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new'? It has been already in ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to be among those who come after us." Now, there's a lot to what he's saying here that goes beyond just the surface words. Part of it, I believe, to be absolutely true, depending on how you're looking at it. Everything that we do, like I said last week, we're pretty much just reconstructing things based on the blocks God gave us to work with. He gave us atoms and matter and dirt and water and stuff to make stuff with, right? And in the end, it's still just dirt and water and clay and marble and stuff like that. In the end, nothing is really new. Now, maybe you might have shaped it into something slightly unique, but really it's still just marble. Really, it's still just dirt. Nothing is really new. That's one of the meanings. Secondary meaning of this also is, and I noticed this back when I was teaching creation. My favorite segment in our series of teaching creation was on the intelligence of ancient man. That was my favorite part. It wasn't anybody else's favorite part. It was my favorite part. And one of the reasons was because of the fact it didn't matter how far back you went in human history. If anything, people seemed to get smarter the further back you went, not dumber, which runs contrary to the evolutionary paradigm. And even one of the ones that really caught my attention was that there are I'm talking about ancient swords that we've subjected to analysis, and we know the gold that was placed on the hilt of that sword is electroplated, meaning they had to have had some source of electricity. You can't do it any other way. It requires an electric charge. And this thing way predates, the kite and the key. You know what I mean? Where, with Benjamin Franklin and discovering electricity. No, he didn't. He just rediscovered something that had been discovered a long time ago and forgotten. There are a lot of people who have looked at these jars that you see in Egyptology. And one of the things they know for a fact it can do is hold a charge like a battery, and very likely may have been used to do just that. So what has been is what will be, and what we have is just a repeat of something we've had in the past. There's nothing quantifiably new under the sun, right? Now, and I'll give you another example of this. We today think that we're so smart because we've created air conditioning. But, there are people that, living in the desert that had the ability through channelways that ran underneath big concrete structures and were redirected towards the top and would flow air in from various areas, particularly those that were facing large bodies of water from which air was flowing regularly. And it would keep a palace cool down into the 70s and 60s in the middle of a desert. And it didn't require power. Now, who's smarter? You know what I'm saying? Ours will wear out. Theirs, if the structure is still there, is still working. So who was really smarter? Okay, you see what I'm saying? So just because we might find a new expression or another way of doing something doesn't make it quantifiably a new thing. The idea of heat exchange has existed since the Earth has been here. We just found another way to do heat exchange. But it's really, the concept is not anything truly new. Now, here's an example of the logical fallacy of these words if taken literally. If nothing is remembered, then how can the claim be made that all that is happening now has already happened? How would you know if there's no remembrance of things that happened before? There's a logical fallacy there. One of two things could be true about this statement, and those like them throughout this book. Solomon, being clearly a discontented man due to his lifestyle of futile pursuits, projected this emptiness upon everything that he saw. Okay? This negativity upon everything that he saw. Solomon had begun his life with great respect for God and for his father David, if you remember. He was a man of follow-through, not just words. If he said he was going to do it, the man did it. I mean, he was a man of integrity and tremendous respect towards God. Even the things that he built for the temple and stuff like that showed just crazy respect for the God that he worshiped. And the prayer that he prayed over the temple and over Israel was just resounding with wisdom and respect and love for God. That was in his youth, right? And but if you were to read places like in 1 Kings, you find that there seemed to be a progressive, it wasn't all at once, but a progressive, slow turning away from God and towards progressive compromise, foreign wives, idolatry, and forbidden accumulation of power that God never put a stamp of approval on, even to the point where some of the structures that he built was built by very, very unfair taxation of his own people, which his father David would have never done, right? Things that were just ungodly, not the right thing to do. Many scholars believe, and I believe this for a very long time, many scholars believe the book of Ecclesiastes represents his late life reflections on these choices that he made, and they believe that it culminated in a return to a fearing of the Lord by the end of his life, which is written at the very, very end. The very end of the book of Ecclesiastes ends with, fear the Lord and keep his commandments. So there's a lot of scholars, and me not being a scholar, but just someone with a little bit of common sense, have looked at Solomon's life and see, there's a guy that started off with some great intentions, a good heart, but power and opportunity went to his head, and he progressively spiraled downward into worse and worse expressions of ungodliness. And by the time of the end of his life, though, because his wisdom never left him, he looked back on all that he had done and said, you know what? That was just a waste of time. I wasted my life. And really, the only thing that's not a waste is to fear God and keep his commandments. This is what I should have done. I believe that that's the progression. Now, that you need to know, there is no proof, whether biblical or extra biblical, that Solomon himself actually ever repented and changed from his ungodly lifestyle. He may have died in his sins. I don't believe that's the case, because I believe Ecclesiastes was written at the very end of his life. And words like this generally do not come from a person that doesn't exercise true remorse. I think that he came to the conclusion, I've wasted my life, and I'm writing this down in hopes that you won't follow my terrible example, right? And so I think that he probably did come to the end of himself. I pray that he certainly did. Amen. We all wish that for him. So it's possible that his reflections are grounded not only in his personal experience, but in the sadness and the overwhelming sense of futility he saw upon reflection on the ungodliness of his choices throughout most of his life. So that's one of the things that could be meant by this. The second possibility is that Solomon is speaking philosophically on the limitations of human achievement, so that he emphasizes the repetition of human experience, birth, death, labor, desire, which mimics the natural cycles of the sun, rain, wind, spring, summer, fall, winter, all that. His tendency to see everything from human perspective alone, and thus excluding God's eternal perspective. The phrases like under the sun underscoring that focus throughout the book. As also it may be philosophical as a means of satisfaction, for even with his immense wisdom and creativity, Solomon discovered that material achievements, pleasures, and innovation cannot provide true, lasting fulfillment and satisfaction. It wound up being futile in the end. Also, due to his patterns, the way his patterns tended to repeat themselves, what seemed new to one generation is often just a repetition of past events that have been forgotten, so that philosophically, the statement capitalizes more on the tendency of humans to neglect a knowledge of history, so that every rediscovery seems like it's something new, when in fact it isn't. And that's something that we've definitely learned in America. America, by and large, and I think it's because the youth have been trained deliberately, largely by the left, not entirely, because you can't demonize one side without recognizing the problems in the other, but largely who have had the greatest impact, I believe, on education, have led young people away from really learning from history, therefore not repeating its mistakes, right? Instead, they've demonized history and taught lessons that are inconsistent with what we should have learned from history. Are you seeing what I'm saying? So that we wind up repeating them all over again. But if we were people who learned from history, we could save ourselves the trouble of repeating it, right? And I think that's part of the futility and the philosophical nature of what he's saying as well, okay? Verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. Well, that's not exactly a chipper attitude, is it? Now, not to beat a drum to death, but I want to press upon you the lens and the filter through which Solomon was making these observations. It is a real truth that no one is more miserable than a Christian living in sin. That is the most miserable human being on the planet. Their inward nature does not allow them impunity to sin, but rather it gives them a torn inner misery. And such was the case with Solomon. Not because he was righteous in himself, in and of himself, because he wasn't, but rather because his wisdom never left him. So most of us, as I said last week, this is what makes Solomon so unique in human history, is that according to Romans, the first chapter, when we decide through deliberate intention or through neglect to not maintain an awareness and a respect for God in our mind, the awareness of him tapers off and we lose sight of it over time. And therefore, it doesn't have that ongoing effect on our soul that curbs our appetite for sin because we become callous to that voice over time, right? Romans 1 talks about that. Solomon did not lose sight of anything because he remained with wisdom his whole life. So he had nothing to numb that voice. Are you hearing me? So he did everything he did and continued to pursue even deeper and deeper and deeper, all the while having misery multiplied upon himself every time, not getting any better, but getting worse. And so you can see how that would have a profound effect on your view on life, wouldn't it? Right? So, and again, this would not be due to his being righteous, but rather because his wisdom never left him. He could not pursue the emptiness of sin without a clear view to its futileness. There's no satisfaction in any of this. The harder I try, the less fulfilled I feel, right? Yes, ma'am.
Do you suppose that had anything to do with the fact that he had so many wives?
One of the things, but I wouldn't go that far with it. I mean, yes.
I mean, his searching for something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He was searching for satisfaction and fulfillment and meaning. And people are just a pretty empty well to be searching for that. It doesn't matter whether it was a woman looking for it in a man or a man looking for it in a woman. It's not gender specific. None of us have got what it takes to fill the void, right? If you're a woman looking for a man to fill that void, you're going to be very, very disappointed. Even if you got the best man on the planet, you're going to be disappointed. If you have 1,000 wives, you're not going to be satisfied. In fact, because you've got that many, you're probably going to have multiple problems instead of just one, right? But it's not because the women themselves were the problem, Solomon was. Does that make sense? I want to make clear that yes, I do believe having that many wives really multiplied his problem. And many of these wives were ungodly. They are the very ones who turned his heart away to idolatry because they did not love the Lord God either. They still loved their pagan idols. And so, yeah, they were a problem. But they wouldn't have been a problem to Solomon if Solomon hadn't married them. You know what I mean? So Solomon was really his own problem. But yes, that was a manifestation of it, was all the wives. I want to just be, does that answer your question? Yeah. So because his wisdom never left him, he could not pursue the emptiness of sin without a clear view to its futileness. And that had an impact on this survey looking back on his life that we read in the book of Ecclesiastes. Verse 14 and 15. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. Now this is joined by conjunction, the word and. This could be saying two separate things, meaning in other words, everything is truly meaningless and it's also temporary. Or it could just mean that sometimes when in Hebrew, when something's joined by what in English we call a conjunction, it's really being used as a parallel statement where it's just a compound statement. It means it's not only fleeting and temporary, it's really, really, really fleeting and temporary. So it could mean either one, but I think he's really getting at, in verse 14, I think he's really capitalizing on how fleeting things are. It's a grasping for the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. In the instance of Solomon's use of the word vanity regards man's inability to change the cycles of life he just mentioned. Patterns in life repeat themselves over and over again in an endless pattern. Most people can live largely oblivious to this since they are so rooted in the present and don't have much time or even desire to contemplate life like Solomon did. But these patterns serve a very real purpose of God, which actually leads to life if viewed through the lens of eternity rather than, and eternal ends, rather than through the lens of what brings temporary earthly satisfaction. If that's your lens, it's going to definitely show futility. If it's viewed through the lens of eternity, you can see tremendous value. Well, I'll give you an example. The fact that every day you wake up and you make a proclamation to the Lord of your love for him and your desire to honor him and your devotion, your dedication to follow him throughout the day, and to be quick to respond when you sin, and to want to have Jesus formed in you more today than yesterday, and your desire to be used by his grace and by his mercy to further his kingdom and other people. That repeating that day after day after day after day after day can seem monotonous, but can you see in the end the eternal value of that? If you're looking at it through the lens of eternity, this has tremendous value, because it's not just repeating. It's not just a regular circle, like a circle where you end up where you started. It's more like a spiral ending upward, where you might wind up at the same part of the dial, at 12 o'clock, so to speak, every revolution, but you're higher up than you were. Does that make sense? And so that's the difference between the two-dimensional life of humanistic thinking and the three-dimensional view of eternal thinking. Amen. One is leading to something. The other one is just a repeat of the same old thing, right? And so I think that's a very, very important thing. Now, upon reading this, I was immediately reminded of fractals. Now, I know that some of you probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but these are infinitely complex, self-similar patterns generated by repeating simple mathematical rules. Okay, these mathematical rules are simple repeating sets of algorithmic calculations, which are often referred to as iterations, recursions, or substitution rules. Rather than attempting to bore you with a dissertation on them, which I'm hardly qualified to do anyway, I thought that I'd show you a video of two examples of them, which is little more than about 3.5 minutes long. And I chose this length because in one of the two sets, okay, there's two different kinds. Well, there's a bunch of different kinds, but two that I'm going to show you. In one of them, you almost appear as though you're falling into the fractal, like you're falling down, into it. And I thought less time would fail to offer the right impression of an endless cycle, like Solomon was experienced, and more might make you a little woozy. So I chose about 3 minutes on purpose. I chose two of the most famous fractals and primary examples of this, but which produce entirely different results. They are referred to as the Penrose tiles and the Mandelbrot set. The video just shows you a graphical representation of these mathematical equations. You don't see numbers around. You just see pretty designs and colors. That's all you see, all right? But those are representations of these mathematical formulas. And it's just an algorithm. It's probably they could write something, maybe this long. It's a repeating pattern from a mathematical formula, okay? And I chose those two on purpose. The video shows you, like I said, a graphical representation of these two equations. The first example in the video will represent a non-repeating pattern, meaning every time a pattern shows up on the screen, it's a brand new one. Every time this algorithm runs, it's a brand new pattern. It never repeats itself into infinity. Every single time from this point, and if you ran that for an eternity, it produces a brand new image each time, okay? The second is more complex, but infinitely repeating itself. It never ends the exact same thing, and that's called the Mandelbrot set. Both systems are foundational in exploring how simple deterministic rules generate immense complexity and self-similarity, though, as I said, the first one I'm going to show you is a non-repeating structure. Doesn't repeat itself at all. The Mandelbrot set is the one that best represents Solomon's viewpoint on life. It always repeats. It always repeats. It always repeats in a secular pattern. I can't say that. It demonstrates infinite detail, where zooming in only reveals smaller and smaller copies of the original, often exhibiting a recurring structure. And these patterns seemingly blend chaos together with order. Okay, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you watch this. So I'm going to throw this up, and then after we watch this short video, then we'll finish the last few verses. But I thought it would be a great way of illustrating where Solomon's mind was, and maybe where your mind has been at different times. Okay, so it starts off with the one that's non-repeating. Okay, every time it's a brand new one. Roger Penrose is the one that developed it. and I sped it up, so otherwise it would take forever to watch it. This is just a graphical representation of a single formula that repeats itself. But every time it repeats itself, it comes up with a brand new pattern. And it's very two-dimensional.
If you're really interested in the theory of this, I'm pretty sure Answers in Genesis has a video on
Oh, that'd be cool.
fractals and, talking about the mathematical simplified idea of how a mathematical equation ends up producing something like this,
Mm-hmm.
and then how it shows up in nature.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of plants and flowers.
Oh, yes. When you zoom in on them.
It's very, very intriguing. I had never seen it before, but it's amazing. Some of the beauty that comes out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It gave a whole new understanding to me of when people talk about mathematicians talk about how beautiful math is.
Yeah.
It made a whole lot more sense then.
Mm-hmm. So right here is the pattern that winds up repeating itself. Doesn't matter where you zoom in, you're going to wind up with the exact same pattern.
That's crazy.
Now you go into the skin of the pattern, and it's got a pattern that repeats itself over and over and over.
And you're saying this is Solomon's life?
This is Solomon's life. It's the way he viewed everything. It's never ending. It's always repeating. It's mundane, and I'm going to lose my mind because it's never anything different. So it doesn't matter. See all these little tiny points. It's every once in a while I'll veer off to the left and zoom in on one of those little tiny points, and it's the exact same pattern. Every single point is the exact same thing. See, there's a little one, same pattern. Infinitely going on forever, the exact same pattern.
Trying to hypnotize all of us.
Yeah, that's why I made it only a few minutes long, so I didn't want you to said I wanted you to get the point, but I didn't want you to get seasick. But can you see what I'm talking about? It's going right through the center, but then it veers off a little bit towards one of the little tiny dots. And when it does, like right now, there's a little tiny dot, and it's the same pattern in that tiny dot. It's throughout. That's all it's made out of is this one pattern forever. And you have these kind of designs also in nature. Jesus made these things, but it's intended to teach us something. And one of the things that Solomon wound up saying in all of life was this very thing, but he could never tell the importance of it. All he could see was just it's never ending. It's just a pattern that never ends, and it doesn't lead to anything whatsoever. So life seems completely pointless and meaningless to him. Anyway, the idea of a fractal, the Mandarial fractal is what came to my mind when I read it. And I thought, well, that might be a graphical illustration of the endless cycle of life that Solomon felt stuck in. And so his life was a drudgery to him. So yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I could see his life being meaningless if that's a
Yeah.
vision of how his life
That's how it felt to him. And I've had many times in my life, my mind went to that dark place as well. But yeah, so anyway, I just thought it was it may not have done anything for you, but to me it was immediately sprung to mind, so I thought I'd give it as a graphical example. So okay, now we're at the last two verses of the chapter 1. This is to all of this cycle in life that seems to never end in its repeating pattern. To all of this, Solomon says this: I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge also increases sorrow. Now, this last phrase captures nicely what I said earlier. In truth, wisdom does not create vexation and sorrow. It only enables one to recognize it when he sees it. But for the one who possesses wisdom and does not walk in that wisdom causes the heart to be vexed and filled with sorrow. And that is why Solomon was the kind of man he was throughout his life, and that's what influenced the book of Ecclesiastes to say the things it did about his life, about life in general. Okay? So because he had God's wisdom all the way through his life, it was a gift that was never taken away from him, and yet he lived in futile pursuits all of his life. He had a tendency to see everything through a negative lens because nothing in this life satisfies. It can't. And So, and that's the horrible outcome of a person who's got tremendous amounts of wisdom and yet lacks the common sense of coming to the conclusion that I need to change my course, because he desired these other things, and he set his mind to do it. I mean, you read it right in here. I set my mind to explore every option there is under heaven. Limiting his search, it's very, very much like evolution. I mean, in almost every single way. I cannot tell you how many times in a year I get into conversations with people online about this very thing, because they employ what is called the NOMA principle, which is non-overlapping magisteria. It's an idea that was created by an evolutionist to exclude God from consideration and everything that science has to touch. It means, in other words, that non-overlapping magisteria means that science deals with material things, and so it can't include spiritual things. That would be overlapping magisteria. You got your bailiwick, we've got ours. And so anything in science cannot ever consider spiritual conclusions. We've excluded that as a possible. Well, that's not scientific. Science is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of where it leads, right? But science, since NOMA was created, has artificially filtered out an explanatory power out of hand, without ever considering it, without ever allowing it to speak. We cannot even consider that. Well, that's not scientific. Scientific explores every option, right? And this is the reason why, like Frederick Hoyle was one of the guys that discovered the DNA molecule, and he, by the end of his life, along with I think it was Fred Hoyle and Frederick Crick, wasn't it? I think they'd come to the conclusion at the towards the end of their studies that, and they had unlimited resources. They had access to virtually every library on the planet, unlimited resources, unlimited money to discover, the development of DNA and so on. And they came to the end of their conclusion after, I think, a 10-year search that it's categorically impossible for DNA to have developed on this planet unaided by some intelligence. It's not possible. Even under the best and most perfect circumstances, because of the fact that we know that the universe can't be any older than 13 point whatever billion years old, there's just not enough time. It could never have happened. It's impossible. So they speculate, because of NOMA, they can't include the idea of God. So they're looking inside the box, inside of the under the heavens, to find another example. And that's literally where the idea of panspermia came up. The idea that life was seeded here from another planet. Alien life, where there's another planet out there somewhere where the rules of science work differently, and therefore life generated by accident there, and they came and seeded life here on this planet. That's literally where that came from. It didn't come from any evidence. It came from the fact that you're not allowed to include the idea that maybe an intelligence outside of creation created this. You have to only play with the things in the box. And so therefore, the only way this could happen, it can't happen naturally here on the earth. So it had to have been seeded here from another planet. You see how crazy things get. And that's just one example. Another example is the multiple universe idea. That's all to answer the idea. That's to get rid of the God hypothesis, because everything in physics lines up for life to exist in this universe. It's fine-tuned for life. I mean, literally, if you were to imagine a dial on an old radio, if you were to turn one little crank from one vertical line to another, and that's all you shifted, all the even one of the laws of physics, life would be impossible. It's fine-tuned for life. The chances of that happening, and there only being one universe in which it to happen, is not possible. Mathematically, it can't happen. And because of that, they created, with no evidence, there's no proof for multiple universes, none. Now, it's all the way through science fiction. I mean, you see it in science fiction all the time, multiple universes. There's no proof for it. The only reason the idea was conceptualized was because of the fact they wanted to get rid of the idea of the necessity for God. So there are literally infinite number of universes out there, and we just happen to get the roll of the lucky dice. We just got the lucky roll of the dice. All the other ones, there's no life in, but ours does. We just happen to get the lucky roll. It was bound to happen in one of them. We just happened to be in the one that happened. See how silly ideas have to get when you exclude God out of your purview, right? And that's the kind of world that Solomon lived in, where he's looking for some type of satisfaction, but he wasn't allowing God to be it. And so no wonder his life felt futile and meaningless and empty. Amen. And so that's the way the entire book, it's from that mindset, looking back on that he wrote all that he wrote. So we're going to, we'll see a whole lot more in the chapters coming up, but that is his filter. So that's the reason why the book, if you don't understand where Solomon was coming from and you don't know the end conclusion that he arrived at the end, you would think, oh my gosh, this is just a terribly depressing book and I'm getting nothing out of it whatsoever. But really, that is the point of the book, is that these things are in fact true if God is not in your equation. If you do include God into it, it literally flips the entire argument on its ear, because everything that was meaningless now has intrinsic value, right? All right. Anybody have any questions or statements about what we've covered tonight? So, all right, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father God, we want to
Grace. Grace.
Grace.
Grace.